one of Boston's most nefarious stories, one that doesn't paint the city in a positive light. And yet the filming of Black Mass, the movie version of the Whitey Bulger saga, has been the talk of the town all summer, drawing crowds of onlookers and attracting national media attention. But aside from the thrill of a Johnny Depp sighting, there are some serious questions about the benefits and the drawbacks of bringing major motion pictures to Massachusetts. When Good Will Hunting was released in 1997, it turned Matt Damon and Ben Affleck into household names.
On the campus of one of America's leading universities, the most gifted mind to ever enter its classrooms is the person who cleans its floors.
And it showed that in the right cinematic hands, Boston itself can be a star.
You don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about.
Why, thank you.
It's all right. You've never been out of Boston.
A decade later, state lawmakers decided to leverage that allure. They offered a generous package of incentives to filmmakers, including a 25% subsidy on payroll and production costs. Hollywood has responded with a slew of productions.
She goes across to Dottie's, then she comes home, and Amanda is gone.
You and me have been together for 27 years. Where's my ring? Huh? Where's my ring?
But that doesn't necessarily mean the film tax credit is smart policy. According to the Massachusetts Department of Revenue, the state spends nearly $130,000 for every film industry job filled by a Massachusetts resident.
Well, I personally think that's much too high for any industry, for the Commonwealth and taxpayers to subsidize.
State Senator Jamie Eldridge says the film tax credit is too generous.
I think there's far too much focus on that tax credit when there's a lot of other tax credits that would be a better use of money, or just better investing in transportation or education.
But according to Boston Globe film critic Ty Burr, there are broader gains that shouldn't be ignored.
What a lot of people don't understand is that the tax incentives don't just benefit Hollywood filmmakers. It is energized a whole level of independent filmmakers, you know, some coming out of our schools, some moving here, who are working on the Hollywood films and then going off and making films of their own.
Burr calls the burgeoning local film industry a success, a welcome change from the days when the weather and perceived union hostility kept movie makers away. Still, Burr does think there's been a striking narrowness in the way Boston gets portrayed.
I think there's a lopsided image of Boston being portrayed in mainstream film, and you can kind of forgive it because it's the most dramatic. When people think of Boston movies, they think of Southie. They think of people popping caps in other people's heads.
In fact, Burr says there are plenty of other good local stories to tell. One topic in particular tops his wish list.
The Great Boston Movie has yet to be made, and the Great Boston Movie will be about a subject that nobody in Boston wants to see it made, and that's busing. That is the most dramatic and truest to the very complicated personality of Boston. All the different clans, all the different classes, all butting heads against each other.
But many locals are just happy to see their neighborhoods appear on the big screen. Last week, a small crowd gawked as part of Revere Beach was turned into Miami for the Whitey Bulger film Black Mass. Among them, Vincent Loretano, whose pizza parlor was closed for the shoot.
I think it's good. Bring money into the state. I mean, I am closed on the busiest time of the year in July, but, you know, I'm being compensated for that, so, you know, it's good for me, I guess.
Which brings us back to Beacon Hill, where State Senator Jamie Eldridge says there's a growing sense that the tax credit should be rethought. That said, he has a confession.
When Labor Day was made in my hometown of Acton, my mom walked down to the set to watch the film being made.
Apparently, economic costs and benefits pale in comparison to seeing Josh Brolin and Kate Winslet up close. Disclaimer here, WGBH has been a beneficiary of the Massachusetts Film Tax Credit. I should also mention that we were planning to have Lisa Strout, the director of the Mass Film Office, on our show today, and she canceled. That being said, we do have Michelle Meek from New England Film. Michelle, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start by asking you what New England Film's place in the local film infrastructure or ecosystem is.
Sure.
What do you guys do?
NewEnglandFilm.com is an online magazine and resource for the filmmaking community in New England, and that means not only local filmmakers, but anyone who's coming to the area to film something can find cast and crew and locations and learn about what's going on in the local industry and so on.
So as you were explaining that, the first thing that popped in my head was sort of a Craigslist for filmmakers. Is that too simplistic?
That's a big part of it. We also have a magazine section, so we have a lot of stories about what's going on in the industry and industry news, things like that. So.
And would you say that you guys have been beneficiaries of the film tax credit? credit program?
If so, very indirectly, in the sense that if filmmaking is doing well in New England or in Massachusetts, then certainly NewEnglandFilm.com will succeed more as well. So,
Okay.
But not directly. We don't apply for the credits or anything like that.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's bring in Steve Poftak. He's the executive director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Rappaport Institute. Steve, thanks for being here. And I'm hoping that you and Michelle can help me understand in a little greater detail how these tax credits work exactly, because they're a little bit confusing. Let's say that I'm a filmmaker who spends $10 million on payroll and $10 million on production in a given year. What happens then?
A portion of that is refundable in terms of you receive money back on your tax liability, and you also receive it back whether or not you have any tax liability or not. A portion of the payroll, and then a portion of what's spent on the actual production itself.
25%, right?
Yes,
Not an insignificant
that's
portion.
correct.
And then if you don't have enough tax liability to take advantage of that, you can sell it, correct? They're transferable?
Yes, and this makes it a very robust tax credit in that it's refundable and transferable. It's refundable, you get paid whether or not you have tax liability, and it's transferable. You can pass it on to a third party and be compensated in return.
So a company like John Hancock could buy a substantial tax credit that a filmmaker couldn't use for 90%, 90 cents on the dollar, and then use it themselves.
That's correct.
Okay. What is your take on the film tax credit program as a matter of public policy? Do you think it needs reform? Do you think it's working adequately? Then a few minor tweaks would be okay?
I think the question to grapple with here is how best to promote the film industry in Massachusetts and in New England. And my position would be that the tax credit is just too strong a mechanism in terms of the rewards are. It's very expensive, and it's providing it's funding transitory jobs that are only short term. So this isn't necessarily about being supportive of the film industry. It's, do we have the right mechanism in place to be supportive of it?
What do you think as someone who works in and with the industry? Do you like the status quo, or might change be appropriate?
Well, I think that perhaps there's some oversight that needs to be done, but I think that in general the tax credits work. There have been a lot of studies done that show that it's not just the money that's spent and those transitory jobs, but in order to have real infrastructure in the film community, there needs to be consistent film production here, and to get consistent film production here, we need to have a competitive tax credit. And I know that there are many people who are concerned about a race to the bottom, and that's a legitimate concern, I suppose. But
with a bunch of states implementing similar programs, right?
But at the same time, I think that Massachusetts has done well in the film industry, and it's partly because they have competitive tax credits.
Let's take a look at some of the numbers that we picked out involving the performance of the Massachusetts film industry. They show that, among other things, the number of productions shot up after the new, more robust tax credit was created, and then has dropped again in the last couple years. They also show that the total number of dollars being spent, we're looking at dollars in millions here, again, went up after the credit. The current credit was created, then dropped down hard in 2010, maybe connected to the recession, and inched back up in 2011, but still isn't where it used to be. And finally, I'm fascinated by the numbers showing how much Massachusetts residents and businesses are benefiting here. Again, that sort of, well, I shouldn't say again, that's been level, went up in 2010 and then dropped down again in 2011. So you're saying the film tax credit works. Do these numbers give you any kind of pause?
Well, I think there's more to it than just the tax credit. Obviously, Rhode Island does not have as competitive a tax credit as Massachusetts, and yet Woody Allen is shooting there right now. So it has to do with going out and getting that business. That's what the film office does. So it's not just having the credit, in other words. But I think that it's an important thing, and it's hard to just look at certain numbers and decide whether it's working based on the numbers of film dollars spent, because there's residual income, and that's what a lot of the studies will show, is that there's tourism dollars, there's businesses that are built that then succeed after that. There's much more to it than just the amount spent during that production.
Steve, what do you make of this idea of indirect economic benefits?
Certainly there are indirect economic benefits, but I think that, there would be indirect economic benefits if we pivoted this money and spent it on some other industry. So I accept the point that there is that benefit, but I do raise the question of, is this the most efficient way to spend state money in terms of supporting this industry and in supporting creating jobs in general.
Would you like to see the credit capped? Because I know that was a proposal in the House last year. It was voted down. Lawmakers basically said, if we're going to do this, we have to do it, completely enthusiastically. Might a cap be appropriate from your point of view?
At least a cap, if not eliminating the credit altogether.
Since both of you, like me, live in the area, although are you in Rhode Island? Am I correct? All right. As people who at least spend time in the Boston area, what's your take on the representations of the city and of Massachusetts that we've seen in recent years? It does seem like, as Ty Burr said, there's a lot of, let's take a look at crime occurring in this particular gritty blue-collar milieu. Does that give you any sort of concern?
Well, that's Hollywood for you, in my opinion. Hollywood
What do you mean?
Hollywood tends to have a very narrow-minded portrayal of different topics, places, no doubt. So it's not surprising that Boston tends to play well. It's been stereotyped to some extent.
So would that really make tourists want to come here? I mean, if they're watching, a fictitious Whitey Bulger.
Why not? Oh, yeah.
You may have a different kind of idea of summer fun, I guess, than I do, but that's fine. We'll leave it there. Michelle Meek and Steve Poftak, thank you both for being here.